In the autumn of 1994, a science fiction film slipped into cinemas carrying almost no institutional support, a director Hollywood had barely heard of, and a premise so strange that most studio executives refused to finance it. That film was Stargate. Directed by Roland Emmerich and co-written with producer Dean Devlin, it imagined an ancient ring-shaped device buried beneath the Egyptian sands that could transport human beings across the galaxy to a world ruled by a parasitic alien masquerading as the sun god Ra. Nobody in the industry thought it would work. Nearly $197 million at the worldwide box office later, everybody wished they had believed in it sooner. But the finished film sitting in those cinemas in October 1994 was only the visible surface of a production that was, beneath it, an almost continuous sequence of bizarre decisions, accidental discoveries, near collapses, and unintended consequences. Here are 12 of the strangest facts surrounding Stargate that the studio certainly never put in the press kit. Before a single frame of Stargate was ever shot, Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin spent an extended period being told no by virtually every major American studio they approached. The problem was not the concept itself, though plenty of executives found the ancient astronaut premise bewildering enough. The deeper problem was money. Development rooms across Hollywood ran the numbers on what a film of this apparent scope would require, factoring in the desert planet setting, the Egyptian iconography, the alien technology, the large-scale battle sequences, and the sheer physical size of everything Emmerich was describing, and kept arriving at the same figure. $100 million. That was what the studios believed this film would cost to make properly. Emmerich insisted he could deliver it for roughly half that amount. Not a single studio believed him. This was a German filmmaker who had entered the American industry through the side door of Universal Soldier, a reasonably successful action film he had taken over from another director at the last minute. That was not the resume that inspired confidence when you were being asked to trust someone with an alien pyramid adventure. The breakthrough eventually came through Mario Kassar, an executive producer with a personal passion for Egyptian art and history, whose enthusiasm opened a door to the French company Le Studio Canal Plus. They agreed to finance the film at approximately $55 million. Emmerich delivered it on budget. The studios that said it could not be done watched it earn nearly $200 million and said nothing. The story of how Kurt Russell came to play Colonel Jack O'Neill is one of the more embarrassing administrative failures in the film's production history. Before Russell was ever genuinely committed to the role, he received what he believed was the script for Stargate and rejected it. Then he rejected it again, and then he rejected it a third time. For a significant stretch of pre-production, the people attempting to recruit Russell were confused about why he kept refusing, and Russell himself was completely unaware that anything was wrong. The explanation, when it finally surfaced, was straightforward and faintly mortifying. Someone had been sending Russell an early working draft of the screenplay, an internal document that was never meant to leave the writer's room. That version was incomplete, tonally uncertain, and gave no meaningful impression of what the film was actually trying to accomplish. It was, by all accounts, not a good read. Russell encountered it, formed a reasonable opinion based on what he had been given, and declined. He was not wrong to decline. He just was not reading the right document. When the actual finished shooting script finally reached him, his response was entirely different. Producer Dean Devlin later described Russell's reaction as something close to, "This is not so bad." Add to that a reported salary of $7 million at a time when Carolco Pictures was already beginning to strain financially, and Russell came aboard. The wrong script nearly cost the film its lead. Jaye, Davidson, did not come from the world of professional acting in any conventional sense. He was a London-based fashion designer who had fallen into cinema almost by accident, discovered at a party, and eventually cast in The Crying Game in 1992. That film earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, which brought a level of public attention he found deeply unwelcome. When the Stargate producers came to him about playing Ra, the alien entity at the film center, Davidson had no particular interest in stepping back under that kind of scrutiny. He devised what he considered a foolproof exit strategy. He told the producers his price was $1 million, a figure he was completely certain no production would agree to pay for an actor with his limited credits and public profile. He was not negotiating. He was ending the conversation. The producers accepted without hesitation. Davidson, having successfully trapped himself, had no choice but to make the film. The result is one of the more genuinely unusual performances in 90s science fiction, a presence so otherworldly and androgynous that R.A. reads less like a villain and more like something that has forgotten it was ever supposed to pretend to be human. James Spader's path to playing archaeologist Daniel Jackson began with an opinion he has never softened in subsequent interviews. He read the Stargate script and found it awful. That is not a polite, retrospective qualification offered from the comfortable distance of box office success. He genuinely believed the writing was poor. What is interesting is what happened next. Rather than simply declining and moving on, Spader became curious about who could look at that same material and see something worth making. He wanted to understand what Roland Emmerich was thinking. He sought out a meeting with the director, and that meeting was apparently persuasive enough to change his position entirely. Emmerich communicated something about the film's ambition and spirit that the page itself had not conveyed, and Spader came aboard. But the tension around the quality of the dialogue did not dissolve once production began. There came a day during filming when Spader refused to leave his trailer because he believed the scenes scheduled for that day were written so poorly that performing them without revision would be professionally unconscionable. Production halted. The entire crew waited. What eventually moved the situation forward was Kurt Russell, who went directly to the trailer and had a conversation with Spader that has since passed into the mythology of the films, making its precise content varying depending on who is telling the story. The journey to casting Colonel Jack O'Neill did not begin with Kurt Russell, before the wrong script debacle and the eventual deal that brought Russell on board. Two considerably different names were in serious consideration for the role. Sean Connery was offered the part. So was Wesley Snipes. Neither accepted. The specific reasoning behind each rejection is not fully documented in the public record, but the range of those two choices tells its own story about how the filmmakers were imagining the character at different points in development. Connery in 1994 was still one of the most authoritative screen presences of his generation, a man capable of suggesting decades of weight and consequence simply by standing still, which would have suited the hollowed-out grief that defines O'Neill's arc Snipes. Meanwhile, was riding an entirely different kind of momentum, having come off the visceral energy of New Jack City and the more playful register of Demolition Man, and would have brought a completely different quality to the characters. Controlled recklessness. The version of Stargate with either of those men in the lead would have been a meaningfully different film. The version that actually got made ended up with Russell, which happened almost by accident, and worked out rather well for everyone. David Arnold is now comfortably established as one of the most significant British film composers of his era, the man who scored 5 consecutive James Bond films from Tomorrow Never Dies through Quantum of Solace. In 1994, he was a 32-year-old who had one low-budget British crime thriller to his name and was actively seeking employment at a video rental store to cover his living expenses between composing projects. The young American's his only prior film credit had not exactly put his name in front of major Hollywood productions. What connected Arnold to the Stargate team was a chain of relationships running through one of the young American's executive producers to an executive at Carolco Pictures, who passed Arnold's music along to Emmerich and Devlin. They responded to it and decided to take a chance on a completely unknown composer for a $55 million production. Arnold spent months working on the score, revising it continuously as production timelines shifted, ultimately producing a sweeping orchestral work that drew on ancient Egyptian musical traditions and framed the film's more grandiose sequences with exactly the sense of scale they needed. The job that rescued his composing career arrived at the precise moment he had concluded he could no longer sustain one. In October 1994, the web was not what it is now. Most people had never visited a website. The idea that a film studio would invest resources in building an online presence to promote a theatrical release was not just unusual, it was genuinely unprecedented. And yet Stargate is consistently cited as the first film ever to have an official website created specifically around its release. This places the film in an unexpected historical position as both a science fiction story about ancient alien technology and an actual pioneer of the digital promotional landscape that every major film now inhabits as a matter of course. There was no social media strategy to complement it. There were no online trailers, no influencer partnerships, no algorithmic targeting. There was simply a website existing in a moment when the majority of the audience it was theoretically reaching had never once navigated to a URL. That the people making Stargate were willing to plant a flag on the early internet while simultaneously being rejected by every major Hollywood studio is a particular kind of irony. They were too futuristic for the present and exactly right about the future. Critical reception to Stargate at the time of its release was not kind. Reviews ranged from mildly skeptical to actively hostile, and the most devastating of them all came from Roger Ebert, whose influence over American film culture in 1994 was difficult to overstate. Ebert gave Stargate a single star out of 4 and opened his review with one of the more surgical pieces of critical demolition the film received. He wrote that Tim Burton's Ed Wood, a film specifically about cinema's most legendarily incompetent director, seemed to have been made as a form of preparation for Stargate's arrival. That is not a mixed review. That is a verdict. Ebert's core argument was that the premise itself, ancient extraterrestrial visitors, enslaved human populations, wormhole transit between worlds, was genuinely rich with imaginative possibility, and that Emmerich and Devlin had taken all of that possibility and replaced it with the most generic action mechanics imaginable. The grand ideas dissolved into something that could have been filmed in a warehouse. The sense of wonder that Ebert believed science fiction owed its audience was entirely absent. The film earned nearly $200 million anyway. The audiences and the critic were looking at entirely different things. In 1994, Djimon Hounsou had not yet delivered the performances that would earn him Academy Award nominations for In America and Blood Diamond and establish him as one of the most compelling actors of his generation. He was a relatively early career presence taking roles where they were available. In Stargate, he played Horus, a personal guard to R.A., a physically powerful role built entirely around presence and movement rather than dialogue or character interiority. He did not need lines to register. He needed to occupy space in a way that communicated danger, and he did. What is strange is how the film chose to acknowledge him in the credits. Hounsou is listed simply as Djimon without a surname. This was not a professional name he had adopted. It was not a decision made in consultation with the actor. It was simply how the production recorded him, a single name like a footnote. For someone who would go on to become one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood drama over the following 2 decades, being listed by a single first name in an early film feels like an unintentional document of exactly how little the industry understood about what it had in front of it.